articles in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, beginning on April 4th, 1849. The text is made up from lectures delivered by Marx before the German Workingmen's Club of Brussels in 1847. The series was never completed. The promise to be continued at the end of the editorial in number 269 of the newspaper remained unfulfilled in consequence of the precipitous events of that time. The invasion of Hungary by the Russians. Tsarist troops invaded Hungary in 1849 to keep the Austrian Habsburg dynasty in power, and the uprisings in Dresden, Iserlohn, Elberfeld, the Palatinate, and in Baden. Note, spontaneous uprisings in Germany in May to July 1849, supporting the imperial constitution, which were crushed in mid-July, which led to the suppression of the paper on May 19, 1849. And among the papers left by Marx, no manuscript of any continuation of these articles has been found. Wage Labor and Capital has appeared as an independent publication in several editions, the last of which was issued by the Swiss Cooperative Printing Association in Hattingen, Zurich in 1884. Hitherto, the several editions have contained the exact wording of the original articles, but since at least 10,000 copies of the present edition are to be circulated as a propaganda tract, the question necessarily forced itself upon me: would Marx himself, under these circumstances, have approved of an unaltered, literal reproduction of the original? Marx, in the 40s, had not yet completed his criticism of political economy. This was not done until toward the end of the 50s. Consequently, such of his writings as were published before the first installment of his critique of political economy was finished deviate in some points from those written after 1859, and contain expressions and whole sentences which, viewed from the standpoint of his later writings, appear inexact and even incorrect. Now, it goes without saying that in ordinary editions, intended for the public in general, this earlier standpoint, as part of the intellectual development of the author, has its place, that the author, as well as the public, has an indisputable right to an unaltered reprint of these older writings. In such a case, I wouldn't have dreamed of changing a single word in it, but it is otherwise when the edition is destined almost exclusively for the purpose of propaganda. In such a case, Marx himself would unquestionably have brought the old work, dating from 1849, into harmony with his new point of view, and I feel sure that I am acting in his spirit when I insert in this edition the few changes and additions which are necessary in order to attain this object in all essential points. Therefore, I say to the reader at once, this pamphlet is not as Marx wrote it in 1849, but approximately as Marx would have written it in 1891. Moreover, so many copies of the original text are in circulation that these will suffice until I can publish it again, unaltered, in a complete edition of Marx's works, to appear at some future time. My alterations center about one point. According to the original reading, the worker sells his labor for wages, which he receives from the capitalist. According to the present text, he sells his labor power, and for this change I must render an explanation to the workers in order that they may understand that we are not quibbling or word juggling, but are dealing here with one of the most important points in the whole range of political economy. To the bourgeois, in order that they may convince themselves how greatly the uneducated workers, who can be easily made to grasp the most difficult economic analyses, excel our supercilious, quote, cultured folk, for whom such ticklish problems remain insoluble their whole life long. Classical political economy borrowed from the industrial practice the current notion of the manufacturer, that he buys and pays for the labor of his employees. And there's a footnote there on classical political economy. This is quoting Marx from Capital, Volume 1. By classical political economy, I understand that economy which, since the time of W. Petty, has investigated the real relations of production in bourgeois society, in contradistinction to vulgar economy, which deals with appearances only, ruminates without ceasing on the materials long since provided by scientific economy, and there seeks plausible explanations of the most obtrusive phenomena for bourgeois daily use, but for the rest confines itself to systematizing in a pedantic way, and proclaiming for everlasting truths trite ideas held by the self-complacent bourgeoisie with regard to their own world, to them the best of all possible worlds. End of quote. Back to the text. This conception had been quite serviceable for the business purposes of the manufacturer, his bookkeeping and price calculation, but naively carried over into political economy, it there produced truly wonderful errors and confusions. Political economy finds it an established fact that the prices of all commodities, among them the price of the commodity which it calls labor, continually change, that they rise and fall in consequence of the most diverse circumstances, which often have no connection whatsoever with the production of the commodities themselves, so that prices appear to be determined, as a rule, by pure chance. As soon, therefore, as political economy stepped forth as a science, it was one of its first tasks to search for the law that hid itself behind this chance, which apparently determined the prices of commodities, and which in reality controlled this very chance. Among the prices of commodities, fluctuating and oscillating, now upward, now downward. The fixed central point was searched for around which these fluctuations and oscillations were taking place. In short, starting from the price of commodities, political economy sought for the value of commodities as the regulating law, by means of which all price fluctuations could be explained, and to which they could all be reduced in the last resort. And so, classical political economy found that the value of a commodity was determined by the labor incorporated in it and requisite to its production. With this explanation it was satisfied, and we too may for the present stop at this point. But to avoid misconceptions, I will remind the reader that today this explanation has become wholly inadequate. Marx was the first to investigate thoroughly into the value-forming quality of labor, and to discover that not all labor which is apparently or even really necessary to the production of a commodity, imparts under all circumstances to this commodity a magnitude of value corresponding to the quantity of labor used up. If, therefore, we say today in short, with economists like Ricardo, that the value of a commodity is determined by the labor necessary to its production, we always imply the reservations and restrictions made by Marx. Thus, much for our present purpose, further information can be found in Marx's Critique of Political Economy, which appeared in 1859 and in the first volume of Capital. But, as soon as the economists applied this determination of value by labor to the commodity labor, they fell from one contradiction into another. How is the value of labor determined? By the necessary labor embodied in it. But how much labor is embodied in the labor of a laborer of a day, a week, a month, a year? If labor is the measure of all values, we can express the value of labor only in labor, but we know absolutely nothing about the value of an hour's labor, if all that we know about it is that it is equal to 1 hour's labor. So thereby we have not advanced one hair's breadth nearer to our goal. We are constantly turning about in a circle. Classical economics, therefore, essayed another turn. It said, the value of a commodity is equal to its cost of production. But what is the cost of production of labor? In order to answer this question, the economists are forced to strain logic a little. Instead of investigating the cost of production of labor itself, which unfortunately cannot be ascertained, they now investigate the cost of production of the laborer. And this latter can be ascertained. It changes according to time and circumstances, but for a given condition of society, in a given locality, and in a given branch of production, it too is given, at least within quite narrow limits. We live today under the regime of capitalist production, under which a large and steadily growing class of the population can live only on the condition that it works for the owners of the means of production, tools, machines, raw materials, and means of subsistence, in return for wages. On the basis of this mode of production, the laborer's cost of production consists of the sum of the means of subsistence, or their price in money, which on the average are requisite to enable him to work, to maintain in him this capacity for work, and to replace him at his departure, by reason of age, sickness, or death, with another laborer, that is to say, to propagate the working class in required numbers. Let us assume that the money price of these means of subsistence averages 3 shillings a day. Our laborer gets, therefore, a daily wage of 3 shillings from his employer. For this, the capitalist lets him work, say, 12 hours a day. Our capitalist, moreover, calculates somewhat in the following fashion. Let us assume that our laborer, a machinist, has to make a part of a machine which he finishes in 1 day. The raw material, iron and brass in the necessary prepared form, costs 20 shillings. The consumption of coal by the steam engine, the wear and tear of this engine itself, of the turning lathe, and of the other tools with which our laborer works, represent, for 1 day and 1 laborer, a value of 1 shilling. The wages for 1 day are, according to our assumption, 3 shillings. This makes a total of 24 shillings for our piece of a machine. But the capitalist calculates that, on an average, he will receive for it a price of 27 shillings from his customers, or 3 shillings over and above his outlay. Whence do the 3 shillings pocketed by the capitalist come? According to the assertion of classical political economy, commodities are, in the long run, sold at their values. That is, they are sold at prices which correspond to the necessary quantities of labor contained in them. The average price of our part of a machine, 27 shillings, would therefore equal its value, i.e. equal the amount of labor embodied in it. But of these 27 shillings, 21 shillings were values already existing before the machinist began to work. 20 shillings were contained in the raw material, 1 shilling in the fuel consumed during the work and in the machines and tools used in the process and reduced in their efficiency to the value of this amount. There remains 6 shillings, which have been added to the value of the raw material. But according to the supposition of our economists themselves, these 6 shillings can arise only from the labor added to the raw material by the laborer. His 12 hours' labor has created, according to this, a new value of 6 shillings. Therefore, the value of his 12 hours' labor would be equivalent to 6 shillings. So we have at last discovered what the value of labor is. "Hold on there," cries our machinist. 6 shillings, but I've received only 3 shillings. My capitalist swears high and day that the value of my 12 hours' labor is no more than 3 shillings, and if I were to demand 6, he'd laugh at me. What kind of a story is that? If, before this, we got with our value of labor into a vicious circle, we now surely have driven straight into an insoluble contradiction. We searched for the value of labor, and we found more than we can use. For the laborer, the value of the 12 hours' labor is 3 shillings. For the capitalist, it is 6 shillings, of which he pays the working man 3 shillings as wages, and pockets the remaining 3 shillings himself. According to this, labor has not 1 but 2 values, and moreover, 2 very different values. As soon as we reduce the values, now expressed in money, in labor time, the contradiction becomes even more absurd. By the 12 hours' labor, a new value of 6 shillings is created. Therefore, in 6 hours, the new value created equals 3 shillings, the amount which the laborer receives for 12 hours' labor. For 12 hours' labor, the working man receives, as an equivalent, the product of 6 hours' labor. We are thus forced to one of 2 conclusions. Either labor has 2 values, one of which is twice as large as the other, or 12 equals 6. In both cases, we get pure absurdities. Turn and twist as we may, we will not get out of this contradiction as long as we speak of the buying and selling of labor and of the value of labor. And just so it happened to the political economists. The last offshoot of classical political economy, the Ricardian school, was largely wrecked on the insolubility of this contradiction. Classical political economy had run itself into a blind alley. The man who discovered the way out of this blind alley was Karl Marx. What the economists had considered as the cost of production of, quote, labor was really the cost of production, not of labor, but of the living laborer himself. And what this laborer sold to the capitalist was not his labor. Quote, "So soon as his labor really begins," says Marx, "it ceases to belong to him, and therefore can no longer be sold by him." Unquote. At the most, he could sell his future labor, i.e., assume the obligation of executing a certain piece of work in a certain time. But in this way, he does not sell labor, which would first have to be performed. But not for a stipulated payment, he places his labor power at the disposal of the capitalist for a certain time, in case of time wages, or for the performance of a certain task, in case of piece wages. He hires out or sells his labor power. But this labor power has grown up with his person and is inseparable from it. Its cost of production, therefore, coincides with his own cost of production. What the economist called the cost of production of labor is really the cost of production of the laborer, and therewith of his labor power. And thus, we can also go back from the cost of production of labor power to the value of labor power, and determine the quantity of social labor that is required for the production of a labor power of a given quantity, as Marx has done in the chapter on the buying and selling of labor power, Capital Volume 1. Now, what takes place after the worker has sold his labor power, i.e., after he has placed his labor power at the disposal of the capitalist for stipulated wages, whether they are time wages or piece wages? The capitalist takes the laborer into his workshop or factory, where all the articles required for the work can be found: raw materials, auxiliary materials like coal, dyestuffs, etc., tools, and machines. Here, the worker begins to work. His daily wages are, as above, 3 shillings, and it makes no difference whether he earns them as day wages or piece wages. We again assume that in 12 hours the worker adds by his labor a new value of 6 shillings to the value of the raw materials consumed, which new value the capitalist realizes by the sale of the finished piece of work. Out of this new value, he pays the worker his 3 shillings, and the remaining 3 shillings he keeps for himself. If now the laborer creates in 12 hours a value of 6 shillings, in 6 hours he creates a value of 3 shillings. Consequently, after working 6 hours for the capitalist, the laborer has returned to him the equivalent of the 3 shillings received as wages. After 6 hours' work, both are quits, neither one owing a penny to the other. "Hold on there," now cries out the capitalist. "I've hired the laborer for a whole day, for 12 hours, but 6 hours are only a half a day. So work along lively there until the other 6 hours are at an end. Only then will we be even." And in fact, the laborer has to submit to the conditions of the contract upon which he entered of, quote, his own free will, and according to which he bound himself to work 12 whole hours for a product of labor which only cost 6 hours' labor. Similarly with piece wages. Let us suppose that in 12 hours our worker makes 12 commodities. Each of these costs a shilling in raw materials and wear and tear, and is sold for 2.5 shillings. On our former assumption, the capitalist gives the laborer 0.25 of a shilling for each piece, which makes a total of 3 shillings for 12 pieces. To earn this, the worker requires 12 hours. The capitalist receives 30 shillings for the 12 pieces. Deducting 24 shillings for raw materials and wear and tear, there remains 6 shillings, of which he pays 3 shillings in wages, and pockets the remaining 3, just as before. Here also, the worker labors 6 hours for himself, i.e. to replace his wages, half an hour in each of the 12 hours, and 6 hours for the capitalist. The rock upon which the best economists were stranded, as long as they started out from the value of labor, vanishes as soon as we make our starting point the value of labor power. Labor power is, in our present-day capitalist society, a commodity like every other commodity, but yet a very peculiar commodity. It has, namely, the peculiarity of being a value-creating force, the source of value, and, moreover, when properly treated, the source of more value than it possesses itself. In the present state of production, human labor power not only produces in a day a greater value than it itself possesses in costs, but with each new scientific discovery, with each new technical invention, there also rises the surplus of its daily production over its daily cost, while as a consequence there diminishes that part of the working day in which the laborer produces the equivalent of his day's wages, and, on the other hand, lengthens that part of the working day in which he must present labor gratis to the capitalist. And this is the economic constitution of our entire modern society. The working class alone produces all values, for value is only another expression for labor, that expression, namely, by which is designated in our capitalist society of today the amount of socially necessary labor embodied in a particular commodity. But these values produced by the workers do not belong to the workers. They belong to the owners of the raw materials, machines, tools, and money, which enable them to buy the labor power of the working class. Hence, the working class gets back only a part of the entire mass of products produced by it. And, as we have just seen, the other portion, which the capitalist class retains and which it has to share, at most, only with the landlord class, is increasing with every new invention and discovery, while the share which falls to the working class per capita rises but little and very slowly, or not at all, and under certain conditions it may even fall. But these discoveries and inventions which supplant one another with ever-increasing speed, this productiveness of human labor which increases from day to day to unheard-of proportions, at last gives rise to a conflict, in which present capitalistic economy must go to ruin. On the one hand, immeasurable wealth and a superfluity of products with which the buyers cannot cope. On the other hand, the great mass of society, proletarianized, transformed into wage laborers, and thereby disabled from appropriating to themselves that superfluity of products. The splitting up of society into a small class, immoderately rich, and a large class of wage laborers devoid of all property, brings it about that this society smothers in its own superfluity, while the great majority of its members are scarcely, or not at all, protected from extreme want. This condition becomes every day more absurd and more unnecessary. It must be gotten rid of. It can be gotten rid of. A new social order is possible, in which the class differences of today will have disappeared, and in which, perhaps after a short transition period which, though somewhat deficient in other respects, will in any case be very useful morally, there will be the means of life, of the enjoyment of life, and of the development and activity of all bodily and mental faculties, through the systematic use and further development of the enormous productive powers of society, which exists with us even now, with equal obligation upon all to work, and that the workers are growing ever more determined to achieve this new social order will be proven on both sides of the ocean on this dawning May Day, and on Sunday, May 3rd. Note, Engels is referring to the May Day celebrations of 1891. Signed, Frederick Engels, London, April 30, 1891. So that's the end of the introduction. Before we go on to the preliminary section, I just want to note, these concepts are very fundamental to Marx. The more of particularly later Marx that you read, the more that you see these things. But I think that every time that you go through them, something else just jumps out at you a little bit differently than did the last time that you read through it. On this reading, what stands out to me about the way that Engels was putting that, when he was talking about the worker has to work 12 hours, that's the agreement, but 6 hours he's working for himself. In other words, it's the necessary labor time to basically generate enough value for his wages. And then the other 6 hours he's working for the capitalist. In a way, I think we're so numb to this concept, it just seems like, such accomplished fact and indisputable at this point. But I mean, there really was a point in time where this wasn't necessarily the case. Like, this was a new order, and people were really just newly coming to terms with it and struggling to analyze it. And really, the deal that is put out here by the capitalist, in the case of you work 6 hours to pay for your own wages, basically, and then you work 6 hours just to pay the capitalist for really no good reason. I mean, honestly, what a strange agreement that is. That the tools and raw materials that people need to make stuff to exchange in society, just to pay for their own way in the world, for the reproduction of their organism, as was the subject of this introduction, basically, that you would just have to make this deal to work lots and lots of free hours for somebody else just so that you could access the machinery. And as Engels points out, the more that technology develops to leverage the productivity of labor into more and more goods and services with less and less labor, basically, the less time it takes for you to create enough value to pay yourself the wage, and then just, an increasing share is being paid to the capitalist. And again, why? Just because the capitalist basically has monopoly of force, private property laws that enforce his claim to the means of production. Yeah, we need to get rid of this. And this is basically where we're coming from as Marxists, trying to end this deal where we just have to work to generate capitalists lots of free profit in exchange for working enough to produce stuff for us to live by. That's a really stupid deal, and it doesn't need to be done. And it's tremendously inefficient, and lots of people are just working lots of hours for no other reason than to make a capitalist rich in order to have the privilege of using the workplaces we use to make the stuff that we need to live. Yeah, capitalists can indeed be taken out of that equation. Engels was right. A new social order is possible. It has been done, and we need to keep doing it until socialism covers the entire earth and capitalism has been completely stamped out of existence. Now, let's go on to Marx's portion, starting with the preliminary section. From various quarters, we have been reproached for neglecting to portray the economic conditions which form the material basis of the present struggles between classes and nations. With set purpose, we have hitherto touched upon these conditions only when they forced themselves upon the surface of the political conflicts. It was necessary, beyond everything else, to follow the development of the class struggle in the history of our own day, and to prove empirically, by the actual and daily newly created historical material, that with the subjugation of the working class, accomplished in the days of February and March 1848, the opponents of that class, the bourgeois republicans in France, and the bourgeois and peasant classes who were fighting feudal absolutism throughout the whole continent of Europe, were simultaneously conquered, that the victory of the, quote, moderate republic in France sounded at the same time the fall of the nations which had responded to the February Revolution with heroic wars of independence, and finally that by the victory over the revolutionary working men, Europe fell back into its old double slavery, into the English-Russian slavery. The June conflict in Paris, the fall of Vienna, the tragicomedy in Berlin in November 1848, the desperate efforts of Poland, Italy, and Hungary, the starvation of Ireland into submission. These were the chief events in which the European class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the working class was summed up, and from which we proved that every revolutionary uprising, however remote from the class struggle its object might appear, must of necessity fail until the revolutionary working class shall have conquered, that every social reform must remain a utopia until the proletarian revolution and the feudalistic counter-revolution have been pitted against each other in a worldwide war. In our presentation, as in reality, Belgium and Switzerland were tragicomic, caricaturish genre pictures in the great historic tableau. The one, the model state of the bourgeois monarchy, the other, the model state of the bourgeois republic. Both of them, states that flatter themselves to be just as free from the class struggle as from the European Revolution. But now, after our readers have seen the class struggle of the year 1848 develop into colossal political proportions, it is time to examine more closely the economic conditions themselves, upon which is founded the existence of the capitalist class and its class rule, as well as the slavery of the workers. We shall present the subject in three great divisions. 1. The relation of wage labor to capital, the slavery of the worker, the rule of the capitalist. 2. The inevitable ruin of the middle classes, petty bourgeois, and the so-called commons, peasants, under the present system. 3. The commercial subjugation and exploitation of the bourgeois classes of the various European nations by the despot of the world market, England. We shall seek to portray this as simply and popularly as possible, and shall not presuppose a knowledge of even the most elementary notions of political economy. We wish to be understood by the workers, and moreover, there prevails in Germany the most remarkable ignorance and confusion of ideas in regard to the simplest economic relations, from the patented defenders of existing conditions down to the socialist wonder workers and the unrecognized political geniuses, in which divided Germany is even richer than in duodecimo princelings. We therefore proceed to the consideration of the first problem. So, Section 1, what are wages? How are they determined? If several workmen were to be asked, how much wages do you get? One would reply, I get 2 shillings a day, and so on. According to the different branches of industry in which they are employed, they would mention different sums of money that they receive from their respective employers for the completion of a certain task. For example, for weaving a yard of linen or for setting a page of type. Despite the variety of their statements, they would all agree upon one point, that wages are the amount of money which the capitalist pays for a certain period of work or for a certain amount of work. Consequently, it appears that the capitalist buys their labor with money, and that for money they sell him their labor. But this is merely an illusion. What they actually sell to the capitalist for money is their labor power. This labor power the capitalist buys for a day, a week, a month, etc. And after he has bought it, he uses it up by letting the worker labor during the stipulated time. With the same amount of money with which the capitalist has bought their labor power, for example, with 2 shillings, he could have bought a certain amount of sugar or of any other commodity. The 2 shillings with which he bought 20 pounds of sugar is the price of 20 pounds of sugar. The 2 shillings with which he bought 12 hours use of labor power is the price of 12 hours labor. Labor power, then, is a commodity, no more, no less so, than is the sugar. The first is measured by the clock, the other by the scales. Their commodity, labor power, the workers exchange for the commodity of the capitalist, for money, and moreover, this exchange takes place at a certain ratio. So much money for so long a use of labor power. For 12 hours weaving, 2 shillings. And these 2 shillings, do they not represent all the other commodities which I can buy for 2 shillings? Therefore, actually, the worker has exchanged his commodity, labor power, for commodities of all kinds, and moreover, at a certain ratio. By giving him 2 shillings, the capitalist has given him so much meat, so much clothing, so much wood, light, etc., in exchange for his day's work. The 2 shillings therefore express the relation in which labor power is exchanged for other commodities, the exchange value of labor power. The exchange value of a commodity estimated in money is called its price. Wages, therefore, are only a special name for the price of labor power, and are usually called the price of labor. It is the special name for the price of this peculiar commodity, which has no other repository than human flesh and blood. Let us take any worker, for example, a weaver. The capitalist supplies him with the loom and yarn. The weaver applies himself to work, and the yarn is turned into cloth. The capitalist takes possession of the cloth and sells it for 20 shillings, for example. Now, are the wages of the weaver a share of the cloth, of the 20 shillings, of the product of the work? By no means. Long before the cloth is sold, perhaps long before it's fully woven, the weaver has received his wages. The capitalist, then, does not pay his wages out of the money which he will obtain from the cloth, but out of money already on hand. Just as little as loom and yarn are the product of the weaver, to whom they are supplied by the employer, just so little are the commodities which he receives in exchange for his commodity, labor power, his product. It is possible that the employer found no purchasers at all for the cloth. It is possible that he did not get even the amount of the wages by its sale. It is possible that he sells it very profitably in proportion to the weaver's wages. But all that does not concern the weaver. With a part of his existing wealth, of his capital, the capitalist buys the labor power of the weaver in exactly the same manner as, with another part of his wealth, he's bought the raw material, the yarn, and the instrument of labor, the loom. After he has made these purchases, and among them belongs the labor power necessary to the production of the cloth, he produces only with raw materials and the instruments of labor belonging to him. For our good weaver, too, is one of the instruments of labor, and being in this respect on a par with the loom, he has no more share in the product, the cloth, or in the price of the product, than the loom itself has. Wages, therefore, are not a share of the worker in the commodities produced by himself. Wages are that part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a certain amount of productive labor power. Consequently, labor power is a commodity which its possessor, the wage worker, sells to the capitalist. Why does he sell it? It is in order to live. But the putting of labor power into action, i.e. the work, is the active expression of the laborer's own life, and this life activity he sells to another person in order to secure the necessary means of life. His life activity, therefore, is but a means of securing his own existence. He works that he may keep alive. He does not count the labor itself as a part of his life. It is rather a sacrifice of his life. It is a commodity that he has auctioned off to another. The product of his activity, therefore, is not the aim of his activity. What he produces for himself is not the silk that he weaves, not the gold that he draws up the mining shaft, not the palace that he builds. What he produces for himself is wages, and the silk, the gold, and the palace are resolved for him into a certain quantity of necessaries of life, perhaps into a cotton jacket, into copper coins, and into a basement dwelling. And the laborer who for 12 hours long weaves, spins, bores, turns, builds, shovels, breaks stone, carries hods, and so on, is this 12 hours weaving, spinning, boring, turning, building, shoveling, stone breaking, regarded by him as a manifestation of life, as life? Quite the contrary. Life for him begins where this activity ceases, at the table, at the tavern, in bed. The 12 hours' work, on the other hand, has no meaning for him as weaving, spinning, boring, and so on, but only as earnings, which enable him to sit sit down at a table, to take his seat in the tavern, and to lie down in a bed. If the silkworm's object in spinning were to prolong its existence as caterpillar, it would be a perfect example of a wage worker. Labor power was not always a commodity, or merchandise. Labor was not always wage labor, i.e. free labor. The slave did not sell his labor power to the slave owner any more than the ox sells his labor to the farmer. The slave, together with his labor power, was sold to his owner once and for all. He is a commodity that can pass from the hand of one owner to that of another. He himself is a commodity, but his labor power is not his commodity. The serf sells only a portion of his labor power. It is not he who receives wages from the owner of the land. Rather, it is the owner of the land who receives a tribute from him. The serf belongs to the soil, and to the lord of the soil he brings its fruit. The free laborer, on the other hand, sells his very self, and that by fractions. He auctions off 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his life, one day like the next, to the highest bidder, to the owner of raw materials, tools, and the means of life, i.e. to the capitalist. The laborer belongs neither to an owner nor to the soil, but 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his daily life belong to whomsoever buys them. The worker leaves the capitalist, to whom he has sold himself, as often as he chooses, and the capitalist discharges him as often as he sees fit, as soon as he no longer gets any use, or not the required use, out of him. But the worker, whose only source of income is the sale of his labor power, cannot leave the whole class of buyers, i.e. the capitalist class, unless he gives up his own existence. He does not belong to this or that capitalist, but to the capitalist class, and it is for him to find his man, i.e. to find a buyer, in this capitalist class. Before entering more closely upon the relation of capital to wage labor, we shall present briefly the most general conditions which come into consideration in the determination of wages. Wages, as we have seen, are the price of a certain commodity, labor power. Wages, therefore, are determined by the same laws that determine the price of every other commodity. The question then is, how is the price of a commodity determined? And that's the end of this section. I think that that's fairly clear. The section is also fairly short, so if you need to listen to it again, you can. Basically, Marx is pointing out what is particular about the relationship of the worker to the capitalist in capitalism, as distinct from the relationship of a serf to a feudal lord, etc., and that in capitalism, workers belong to the capitalist class as a whole. It's the only place that workers can really sell their labor power. And of course, we as workers need to sell our labor power in order to get the wages that we need to buy the stuff that we need to live. All right, so the next section, by what is the price of a commodity determined? And remember here that Marx has pointed out in the first section already that labor power is really the only commodity that workers have to sell. Wages, of course, being the special name for the price of that commodity. So by asking by what is the price of a commodity determined, we can determine maybe the price of any commodity, including labor power, or in other words, how are wages determined. Although technically that's the next section, I think Marx splits those up into 2 chapters. But let's start with commodities in general. So, by what is the price of a commodity determined? By the competition between buyers and sellers, by the relation of the demand to the supply, of the call to the offer. The competition by which the price of a commodity is determined is threefold. The same commodity is offered for sale by various sellers. Whoever sells commodities of the same quality most cheaply is sure to drive the other sellers from the field, and to secure the greatest market for himself. The sellers therefore fight among themselves for the sales, for the market. Each one of them wishes to sell, and to sell as much as possible, and if possible to sell alone, to the exclusion of all other sellers. Each one sells cheaper than the other. Thus there takes place a competition among the sellers, which forces down the price of the commodities offered by them. But there is also a competition among the buyers. This, upon its side, causes the price of the proffered commodities to rise. Finally, there is competition between the buyers and the sellers. These wish to purchase as cheaply as possible, and those to sell as dearly or expensively as possible. The result of this competition between buyers and sellers will depend upon the relations between the two above-mentioned camps of competitors, i.e. upon whether the competition in the army of sellers is stronger. Industry leads two great armies into the field against each other, and each of these again is engaged in a battle among its own troops in its own ranks. The army among whose troops there is less fighting carries off the victory over the opposing host. Let us suppose that there are 100 bales of cotton in the market, and at the same time purchasers for 1,000 bales of cotton. In this case, the demand is 10 times greater than the supply. Competition among the buyers, then, will be very strong. Each of them tries to get hold of one bale, if possible, of the whole 100 bales. This example is no arbitrary supposition. In the history of commerce, we have experienced periods of scarcity of cotton, when some capitalists united together and sought to buy up not 100 bales, but the whole cotton supply of the world. In the given case, then, one buyer seeks to drive the others from the field by offering a relatively higher price for the bales of cotton. The cotton sellers, who perceive the troops of the enemy in the most violent contention among themselves, and who therefore are fully assured of the sale of their whole 100 bales, will beware of pulling one another's hair in order to force down the price of cotton at the very moment in which their opponents race with each other to screw it up high. So, all of a sudden, peace reigns in the army of sellers. They stand opposed to the buyers like one man, fold their arms in philosophic contentment, and their claims would find no limit did not the offers of even the most importunate of buyers have a very definite limit. If, then, the supply of a commodity is less than the demand for it, competition among the sellers is very slight, or there may be none at all among them. In the same proportion in which this competition decreases, the competition among the buyers increases. Result, a more or less considerable rise in the prices of commodities. It is well known that the opposite case, with the opposite result, happens more frequently. Great excess of supply over demand, desperate competition among the sellers, and a lack of buyers, forced sales of commodities at ridiculously low prices. But what is a rise, and what a fall of prices? What is a high, and what a low price? A grain of sand is high when examined through a microscope, and a tower is low when compared with a mountain? And if the price is determined by the relation of supply and demand, by what is the relation of supply and demand determined? Let us turn to the first worthy citizen we meet. He will not hesitate one moment, but, like Alexander the Great, will cut this metaphysical knot with his multiplication table. He will say to us, if the production of the commodities which I sell has cost me 100 pounds, and out of the sale of these goods I make 110 pounds, within the year, you understand, that's an honest, sound, reasonable profit. But if in the exchange I receive 120 or 130 pounds, that's a higher profit. And if I should get as much as 200 pounds, that would be an extraordinary and enormous profit. What is it then that serves this citizen as the standard of his profit? The cost of the production of his commodities. If, in exchange for these goods, he receives a quantity of other goods whose production has cost less, he has lost. If he